For 70 years, Soviet believers have lived in a society dominated by atheism. At best, they faced official restrictions. At worst, persecution. This week's celebrations of 1,000 years of Russian Christianity have revealed a new vision of harmony between believers and non-believers. How deep is this transformation, and will it last?
Дети, я сегодня вам хочу рассказать о том, когда филистимляне пришли к Иерусалиму, и среди филистимлян был человек, воин.
Few things illustrate the gulf between atheists and believers in the Soviet Union more sharply than education. In most societies, teaching other people's children Bible stories is normal work for a priest. Here, it's technically illegal.
I give children lessons using the Holy Scriptures, specially illustrated for them and copied on a Xerox machine. I give them the books to take home to read. And here, I can be charged for illegally duplicating religious literature, for which I could get from 1 to 3 years in prison, just because I've used a copier. As you know, this is illegal here. My work with the children here in my home is undoubtedly aimed at the future. We're not afraid. We're looking confidently into the future. And we know that eventually our work will be understood and recognized, and that we will manage to raise a worthy generation devoted to Christian values and life in God.
In Moscow school number 918, religion is also a subject for discussion. Most of the children take part in the school's atheist club.
Здравствуйте, ребята. Садитесь. Начинаем нашу очередную встречу. Вечер вопросов и ответов. И его сегодня с вами проведет Грызунов Сережа и Равина Валя.
The children meet voluntarily after school to discuss atheism and religion. It's clear where progress is thought to lie. The club badge portrays the contrast between night and day. Religion, it says, is darkness. Knowledge is strength. Outside the family, this is the only way children legally can learn about religion. The teacher lets the children speak for themselves.
Ребята, сегодня мы начинаем наш очередной вечер вопросов и ответов.
Мы ведем активно атеистическую работу. Нужна ли эта работа? Вредна ли религия?
Я думаю, что религия на первых своих порах несла культуру, но впоследствии она начала, так сказать, угнетать людей.
В религии нравится ее культура. Это музыка, посвященная религии. Также разные произведения искусства. Живопись, например.
Религия вредна, потому что с ее помощью церковь вводит людей в заблуждение, и они не верят нам. Поэтому я думаю, что мы должны вести более активную атеистическую работу, чтобы людей не вводили в заблуждение.
When the children have finished their well-rehearsed contributions, the teacher sums up. She has a view of religion most believers would find hard to recognize.
Давайте подведем итог тому, вредна ли религия. Вредна тем, что она заставляет человека быть покорным, покориться злу, покориться добру, покориться всему тому, что происходит на земле, но не бороться. Вот это вы должны помнить.
The differences between atheists and Christians stem from Russian history. To communists, the church before the revolution was led by a moribund, ultra-conservative hierarchy, propping up an oppressive Tsarist regime. Lenin nationalized church property and restricted publishing and preaching. In the 1930s, Stalin tried to stamp out belief with a virulent anti-religious campaign. Tens of thousands of churches were closed. Many believers died or were sent to labor camps. Today, atheists denounce such repression with embarrassment.
One could somehow try and explain this immediately after the October Revolution, but it is far harder in the 1920s and 1930s. I would say that it was, to a certain extent, characterized by a kind of immoral attitude, which prevailed at that time towards our own culture. Because ultimately the Orthodox Church is part of our heritage, which we must preserve. And today we really are restoring many of these monuments, and this has become a thing of the past. If you like, as atheists, we have started to pay greater attention to the moral approach to life.
Two days ago, as part of the church's millennium celebrations, the curtains of the Bolshoi Theatre in Moscow opened to display this new moral approach. Church leaders shared a platform with the wife of the Soviet leader, Raisa Gorbachev, and state officials in the latest demonstration of how church and state now wish to transcend their differences. It's a harmony all the more significant because for years the church lived in a twilight world of mistrust and veiled threats.
We really are experiencing something utterly new and remarkable in our life. I'll give you a few examples. In the first place, the opening of new monasteries, the opening of new parishes. Not just one or two, but a great many. Most importantly, getting to the essence of it all. People are quite openly beginning to speak about belonging to the church and are openly visiting churches. We also see how the changes in church-state relations are increasing the number of baptisms and weddings. People now feel at home in the church and are no longer frightened that going to church will result in any kind of unpleasantness at work. The whole climate of the country is changing.
This new climate is strikingly reflected in the media. Last night, this documentary film was broadcast nationwide.
Когда я пришла к вере, то я начала жить. А до этого я была мертва, потому что смерть – это не смерть только тела, а есть смерть души. Так вот, верующий человек – это живой человек, а неверующий – это мертвый человек.
2 or 3 years ago, such a film would not have been broadcast. With thousands of churches turned into factories, even discos, this film questions atheism itself.
Советский Союз стал первой в истории страной массового атеизма. Но нельзя не заметить, как вреден бывает тот атеизм, который видит в религии лишь средство обмана, исключает ее из истории, культуры и духовной жизни общества.
Newspapers too reflect the changes. These are the offices of Ogonyok, a weekly magazine in the forefront of Glasnost. With the easing of censorship, an adventurous editorial policy has boosted the circulation by 800,000 in just 1 year. These features about the church are linked to the Millennium celebrations. Ogonyok's editor welcomes the new debate about religion.
Debates, why not? I think it's good kind of debate, fine kind of debates. But those debates are with arguments from both sides. Because before, it was only one kind of debate, that religion is something for old ladies, and for old retired people. And religion people, it's kind of fighters against our strong ideology. Now we understand that it's possible to exist. If we start to fight for peaceful coexistence with President Reagan, and Mrs. Thatcher was so friendly, invited, and when she was in Moscow, I think it's possible to be friendly with our own church too.
Despite the talk of friendship, real problems lie beneath this calm exterior. One legacy of the old repressions is that millions of Soviet citizens have only negative ideas about religion. Many visitors to this monastery near Moscow view the monk's life here at Zagorsk as merely a relic of past superstitions. To atheists, prayers for the salvation of the world are just substitutes for effective action that would change things for the better. Outside the monastery's walls, an educated young man who chooses to be a monk is likely to be regarded with astonishment.
So far in our country, there are not many believers with a higher education. I hope there will be more, but that is not yet the case. It's commonly believed that education allegedly frees a person from his religious views. And some young people had never had to deal with believers with a higher education. So they were astounded.
With glasnost, the social stigma of being a believer is beginning to fade. But Christians still have the problem of obtaining religious literature. State bookshops do not sell it. Vladimir Oreshkin and Natalia Babassian are believers, though not regular churchgoers. Vladimir wants a Bible. Books on Lenin are not what he has in mind.
Unfortunately, the Bible is very expensive, half my monthly pay. And besides, it's impossible to buy one in shops. It can only be acquired on the black market. I can't afford one. Sadly, religious literature is not sold in shops either, and it's practically impossible to obtain it. One can buy atheist literature, but that's hardly suitable for religious purposes. It is atheist literature after all. For instance, there is an atheist dictionary from which you can learn something about religion. That's the only source, that atheist literature, for a Christian in the Soviet Union, for the average Christian.
As part of the Millennium celebrations, the state has let the church print 100,000 Bibles and import 500,000 as gifts from churches abroad. But in a nation with over 40 million believers, that's not enough. Bishops distribute some copies privately. The rare copies on sale in churches can cost well over £100, beyond the means of believers like Vladimir and Natalia. So, with a new positive mood towards believers, why is religious literature still not sold in the shops?
Well, it was supposed to be a religious propaganda at all times. Maybe that's why. But right now, well, nobody is afraid of Bible, and the fact that there isn't enough to buy or to have or to dispose of the Bible, it's a technical problem. You cannot buy, for example, even Pushkin here so freely.
But what technical problem?
Problem with not enough paper, not enough printing facilities. And as a matter of fact, the church doesn't have any printing facilities of its own.
But there are always enough works of Lenin published.
Sure, that's different. That's different. It's more important. You know, every state has its priorities to set, even in this respect. We cannot set, let's say, the Bible before school books and before Lenin. It's quite understandable.
Another great difficulty for Christians is getting churches reopened. This cathedral is a center of a dispute between believers and non-believers.
Да, я сама проводила. Ну и что вы проводили? Я знаю, что вы учитель, знаю, что вы учитель, да? Ну, безобразие в Ломоносове, вот столько. Конечно.
The argument is about the future of a cathedral in Lomonosov, near Leningrad. The believers want to restore and reopen it. The town council, which has neglected it for so long, wants it to be a museum.
А сейчас она принадлежит государству. Почему не краеведческому музею? А почему и сторонников краеведческого музея больше? Вот вы собирали, а если я начну собирать, я больше соберу. Я грамотный, мы просто знаем законы, которые у нас есть. А какие вы законы знаете?
Верующие, свобода религии.
Свобода религии. Это не значит, что государство дает вам. Правильно, свобода религии.
Свобода религии, успокойтесь. Вот и будем молиться. У нас нет.
The believers have been trying for years to get this church open. Zoya Tikhonravova, an art historian, and her fellow Christians know that the first step is to register officially as a group with the local authority. A petition raised 600 signatures of support. But it took 8 years for the authority to agree to register them.
Why do you need a church in Lomonosov?
Because in our region, Petrodvorets, there is no open Orthodox church. There are about 125,000 people living in this immediate area. Moreover, next to Lomonosov, there are several big towns like Sosnovibor and Kronstadt, where there are no working churches either. So we're talking about a total local population of 250,000 people. Lomonosov is very well placed and right in the center of this huge area. Moreover, this particular church is next to the station.
So why did it take 8 years to register the group? With Glasnost, such questions may now be asked. Answering them is a new experience for most Soviet officials. The council chairman was rather nervous.
At that time, in my opinion, I consider that that group of believers were made up of a specific circle of people who in my opinion, I consider were not a properly formed group. They were all isolated. During a certain period of time, that practically turned out to be 8 years, the lists were examined, and some of the people from those lists simply withdrew from from that idea which had been put forward by the list. As a result, there was no point of contact between the group of believers and our group.
Zoya and the other believers are angered and frustrated by Mr. Yashkov's claims that they changed their minds about wanting a church. They say they are being denied their rights. They are insulted by the small wooden church offered as a compromise by the council.
If there are 20 believers who want to register as a group, they have the complete right to do so without any interference and be given a place of worship. Unfortunately, our local authorities were able to bend these laws and not actively put them into practice.
The government body that settles such disputes is itself housed in former church property. Once the arm of a repressive state, the Council for Religious Affairs now has a much more restrained political ideology. In the new era of rapprochement, the Council is now backing believers' rights against dogmatic local officials.
Practically, local authorities understand the appearance of any new church community, any new church there, as sort of ideological defeat, because they are supposed to be in charge of ideology there. So it's wrong, completely wrong, but that's the way, I mean, this feeling makes it difficult for the local authorities. Even if the law is on the side of the believers, they tried some bureaucratic tricks just to postpone it.
What are you going to do about local authority officials who obstruct such requests for churches?
Well, we are going to apply the law.
But the law itself is still the cause of many problems for Christians. On Moscow's huge impersonal estates, a priest is a rare, even extraordinary sight. Father Alexei agreed to be filmed by us because he doesn't want the splendor and the importance of the Millennium celebrations to obscure what the everyday life of believers is like. He's 36, a former electrical engineer and atheist. He's bringing up his son to resist the atheism he's come to regard as anti-life. In the last 3.5 years, Father Alexei has baptized 2,500 people. But he says his work as a priest is still obstructed and frustrated.
A priest, a believer, does not feel a complete person in an atheist state. A preacher of atheism feels secure in anything he does, while a priest is rated as a second-class citizen. Our fathers built this state. Our fathers built this great country. But now power is mainly in the hands of non-believers. And understandably, we find ourselves in a very difficult situation.
Father Alexei has to travel several miles to his church in a small town outside Moscow called Pushkina. His work here is still controlled by restrictive laws introduced by Stalin. He's not allowed to use church funds to organize any kind of charitable work. He's not allowed to hold a religious discussion group, nor to run a library of religious literature. He cannot even arrange parish outings. Because of this, he feels himself almost powerless to care for his parishioners' welfare. The government is now reviewing those laws.
Well, it's outdated. It's overhauled already. We admitted it because it's dated as far back as 1929. It reflected the situation in connections between state and church at that time, but now it doesn't. It's completely different. That law was supposed to suppress the church as one of the political enemies of a Soviet state. That was good enough for that, but now it cannot practically be implemented because the relations changed and the situation is quite different right now, completely different from that. Now the church isn't the enemy, and isn't political enemy of the state. Why shouldn't it be suppressed after all?
But this change is very new. Only 8 years ago, Father Gleb Yakunin was jailed for campaigning against legal restrictions.
Благословен Бог наш всегда ныне и присно во веки веков. Аминь. Христос воскресе из мертвых. Смерть ее смерть поправ, и сущим во гробех живот даровав. Христос воскресе из мертвых.
Father Gleb is one of over 300 dissidents released in the new atmosphere of Glasnost. He was jailed and exiled for anti-Soviet propaganda, but he was also the symbol of a dispute within the church itself over how to deal with these state controls. Father Gleb believes in protest. In 1976, he was secretly filmed conducting an unauthorized memorial service for believers persecuted since the revolution. The year before, he had smuggled out of Russia a much publicized appeal for support for greater Christian freedom. Most bishops felt his actions were likely to cause trouble rather than help solve the church's problems. Today, Father Gleb has been reinstated as a priest and given a parish some 25 miles outside Moscow. Far from being cynical after his painful experiences, he's now a firm supporter of Glasnost. But he's bitter at what he sees as the bishop's past cowardly compromises with the state.
In those terrible years when we were jailed, sent to psychiatric hospitals, put in labor camps and exiled, we spoke aloud about human rights violations. But sadly, for many decades, 50 years or so, our church leaders never admitted any oppression and never admitted that there were any serious problems or any religious persecution or any incidents when believers were victimized for their faith.
Епископа Алексия, епископа Иннокентия, архиепископа Макария.
Я думаю, что эта критика происходит.
I think that this criticism comes from people who do not understand the nature of the relations between church and state in the difficult years of our history.
В трудные годы нашей истории.
It is always easier to be a critic than a performer. I must say that the relations between church and state were not always brilliant. I don't think that the position of the hierarchy was always something to be admired. But I think that in all probability, history will soon have its say in the matter.
But did the years of accommodation with the Kremlin serve the church or betray it? After the war, the patriotic stand of church leaders was rewarded by the reopening of thousands of churches. The policy of not rocking the boat seemed to be working. The bishops were grateful. A few medals came their way too.
This year, our homeland celebrated the 40th anniversary of the October Revolution. This same year, our church celebrates the 40th anniversary of the re-establishment of the patriarchy, which was possible only under Soviet government when the church obtained freedom in its internal affairs.
That same year, Khrushchev greeted church leaders warmly. Little did they know he was about to launch a new attack on the church, enlisting the services of the bishops themselves. In 1961, the bishops met and took a decision that helped close 2/3 of the churches reopened after the war. They voted away a priest's day-to-day control of his parish, to free him, they said, for more spiritual matters.
Essentially, the Bishops' Convention of 1961 made the priest equal in rights to, say, any worker hired by the parish, to a glazier or an icon painter. In other words, the priest was put in the same category as any temporary employee of the parish. He shared their status. He became one of those who could be hired or fired at any time.
The church was forced into a situation in which it had no choice. It is difficult for someone who did not live through these things to understand the complexity of the situation. And we can say in all seriousness that there was no option. It was not merely conformism, a step backwards, or cowardice. It was a conscious decision on the part of the church to salvage at least something of what it longed to preserve.
Ten years later, again under intense state pressure, a major church council confirmed the transfer of the priest's power to a committee of 3 lay people led by a church warden. In an opening speech, a government official denied state interference.
Разрешите мне по поручению советского правительства сердечно приветствовать участников поместного собора, почетных гостей, глав и представителей зарубежных церквей и международных религиозных центров. Между государством и церковью существуют вполне нормальные отношения. Государство не вмешивается во внутренние дела церкви.
Delegates were not taken in. Father Sergei Hackl was there representing Russian Orthodox clergy from the British Isles.
You couldn't but describe it as a tense atmosphere. Anybody who tried to speak about 1961 was given minimal opportunities to do so, and if it was known that they would speak on that subject, they were even prevented right from the very start. Some people would have wished to speak on it who were local bishops. One we know about, a good, dedicated man, a little man crippled by his experiences, who had prepared very well alternative statutes, reforming the 1961 statutes without doing too much damage to the phraseology. In other words, not much face lost if they were accepted. These had been ruled out of court long before. He sat silent at this council. He had nothing to say on the subject. When asked later why he had kept so silent, he said, 12 years I had of the camps, and you must forgive me. I cannot take any more.
For Father Alexei, that crucial 1961 decision means he's had no real control of his church. He's had no say in the choice of the person who does have control, the warden. He says some wardens are not even believers.
This is my 3rd parish, and I've never had a warden that I could get on with. Most of them are people who pursue their own goals. They're usually not church people, and they completely misunderstand spiritual life. Let us take my first parish of the Savior, near the town of Volokolamsk, where I served for 3.5 years. When I started, the priest's salary was minimal, because the parish was tiny. But when I left, we had 60 to 80 christenings on a Sunday. Would you believe it? It all ended in tragedy, because the warden constantly informed on me. This conflict ended in my transfer. I was bluntly told that it was because of the warden's constant complaints, and the fact that we couldn't find a common language.
By God's grace, the year of the millennium celebration is also a time which has brought the hope of a new freedom and of new possibilities for the Church of Russia. The millennium is not an act of historic remembrance alone, but
4 days ago, an international meeting at Zagorsk gave new hope to parish priests throughout the country. Watched by the world's press and the chairman of the Council for Religious Affairs, the Russian Orthodox Church was at last able to throw out the 1961 decision. Parish priests can now be reinstated at the heart of local Christian communities.
The very climate of the country is changing, and changing so radically that I don't think that there could be a return to the bad times. Everything is in the hands of God, but we pray that the changes which are taking place will be irreversible.
Father Gleb Yakunin is also optimistic, but he still sounds a note of warning to his bishops.
We believe that Gorbachev and Perestroika will overcome our present problems by revitalizing the community, including, of course, the church. However, a Christian must be aware that there are other possible outcomes. This is a unique moment. If we lose this chance, if the enemies of Perestroika suddenly regain the upper hand, then the church will once again be in a vulnerable position. God and history will never forgive us if we lose this wonderful opportunity.
Today, leaders of both church and state are concentrating in public on what unites rather than what divides them. The church has been isolated for years. It's now beginning to re-emerge in the mainstream of Soviet life. Atheists are revising the old sweeping condemnations of religion. A sense of new shared discovery is growing between believers and non-believers. But the divisions and misunderstandings of painful times will take years to disappear.
This is their world, the Bible, prayers, the church service. If, of course, you are only preparing yourself here on earth for life after death, then religion suffices. In my view, I would define atheism as optimistic, and I would define religion as pessimistic.
Христос воскресе из мертвых, смертью смерть поправ. Наш опыт жизни в условиях атеистического.
Our experience of living in an atheist state has brought about all that we're witnessing now. The human soul robbed of its faith is like a bird without wings.
Воскресе из мертвых, смертью смерть поправ. Иисущим во гробе живот даровав, Христос воскресе из мертвых, смертью смерть поправ, Иисущим во гробе живот даровав. Христос воскресе! Воистину воскресе! Христос воскресе! Воистину воскресе!
Next week, a new series of Heart of the Matter begins when Joan Bakewell visits the parish of St Agnes in Andersonstown, where horrific violence took place following the killing of 3 IRA members in Gibraltar. How is this beleaguered community coping now?
Placed by his deputy. The announcement was made after the Soviet President, Mr. Gorbachev, flew to the Ukraine for a meeting of its Communist Party Central Committee in Kiev. He's known to want to bring the Republic into line with his program of political and economic reform.
The British racing driver Nigel Mansell is threatening to give up the sport after being banned from this.
Leader of the Ukrainian Communist Party. Also today, it was announced that one of Mr. Gorbachev's predecessors, Leonid Brezhnev, has been stripped of the Order of Victory medal he was awarded in his lifetime because he did not correspond to the status of the decoration. The Science Museum in London is to face prosecution under
Came on the day the long-serving leader of the Republic's Communist Party, Vladimir Shabitsky, was ousted. He's been replaced by a protege of Gorbachev. While in the Ukraine, he heard from people about their calls for economic reform and greater independence from Moscow. The pound remained firm on the foreign exchange.
See the removal from office of Vladimir Shabitsky, the leader of the Ukrainian Communist Party. It follows his sacking from the Politburo last week after nearly 2 decades of representing the Ukraine. In the Republic itself, his conservative stance was unpopular, and there had been persistent demands for his resignation. From Moscow, Martin Sixsmith reports.
For Mr. Gorbachev, it was a long-awaited moment, the eclipse of the last Brezhnevite member of the Politburo and the chance to introduce new political methods in a republic long ruled with an iron hand. In a walkabout on the streets of Kiev, the Soviet leader had a stern warning for those stirring ethnic tensions. But he refused to condemn the Ukraine's new formed popular movement, Ruch, calling for cooperation with all social groups and rejecting the use of force. Vladimir Ivashka, the Republic's new party chief, is faced with growing nationalist sentiment and increased calls for Ukrainian independence. Ruch supporters are demanding a drastic purge of the communist leadership and greater autonomy from Moscow. Demonstrations by the banned Ukrainian church have swept Lvov and other cities, posing further problems for the party. In the past, similar expressions of dissent were ruthlessly crushed. The new leadership can't afford to tolerate them, but a crackdown would destroy their last claim to popular support.
Joining me now is Taras Kozio, director of the Ukrainian press agency. Mr. Kozio, what kind of thinking will have gone on in Mr. Gorbachev's mind behind this move in the Ukraine? How much of a gamble is he taking?
Cherubitsky was very unpopular in Ukraine. He was synonymous with all the evils of the Brezhnev era, including repression, economic malaise, corruption, denationalization, everything that was wrong with the Brezhnev era. So his ousting was really something that's been demanded by all sections of Ukrainian society for many years. This came to a head in early September when the Ukrainian Popular Front held its first Congress, and the demand for his resignation came from all sections of society, including deputies newly elected to the Supreme Soviet in Moscow. The new leader of the Ukrainian Communist Party, Vladimir Ivashko, is not really much of a gamble because he is really somebody in Brezhnev's mold and Cherubitsky's mold as well. He was brought up as Cherubitsky's right-hand man during the last few years, and so we're not likely to see very many new changes.
So can he really do the Gorbachev job then in the Ukraine? Is he the man to bring in glasnost and perestroika?
Well, until recently, perestroika has not even come to Ukraine. There's been no economic reform in Ukraine. But he's unlikely to be the gentleman to bring in any meaningful glasnost and perestroika into Ukraine because of the simple fact maybe Gorbachev himself has to play two cards. On the one hand, he wants glasnost and perestroika to be implemented in Ukraine, but on the other, he's very afraid of Ukraine blowing up to the same extent as, say, Estonia or Georgia, Armenia. And so he really needs somebody as well to keep control of the Ukraine, which is the most important republic in the USSR.
And how will the nationalist movement then react to a man who's there as much as anything else to keep the lid on them then?
The demands raised by the Ukrainian Popular Front and other groups will continue to escalate. The most important upcoming event will be the elections to the local Supreme Soviet in Ukraine to be held in February, March next year. This is likely to produce a landslide for the Popular Front and against the Ukrainian Communist Party. Their demands are going to continue to escalate. Their demands are going to continue to be radical as they were before. On the one hand, to transform the USSR into a genuine confederation of republics or for outright independence, and also for greater democratization, which has not really come to Ukraine as it has, for example, to Estonia. So they're going to react to him different ways, but one would expect that he would try to make some liberal noises in order to avert that massive defeat of the Ukrainian Communist Party at the local elections coming up.
Because the Ukraine is desperately important to Gorbachev, isn't it? In a way that the Baltic states perhaps are not. It's the hub, isn't it?
Well, Ukraine really decides the fate of the USSR. It's in Ukraine that the fate of the USSR as a superpower will really be decided. And Ukraine is important both in terms of population, economics, geography, and the size of the Ukrainian Communist Party. And really, what he can tolerate in Estonia and Georgia, he cannot tolerate in Ukraine.
Taras Kozio, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
In India, environmentalists have held a huge rally in protest at development schemes.
100 journalists at the Daily Telegraph began a 36 meeting of the Supreme Soviet has granted workers the legal right to strike for the first time in Soviet history. Unions must now follow a set procedure laid out in the new law. The legislation comes as unrest is growing amongst miners in the Ukraine. They won improved pay and conditions after a strike last July. Now they're threatening to go on strike again if Moscow doesn't keep its promises.
The pollution, the heavy industry of the Ukraine. This is the region where President Gorbachev's hopes for his revolution must lie. He himself has said that if perestroika fails here, it fails everywhere. The Ukrainian miners, changing for their pre-dawn shift, know they're the key to the national economy. Back at work after their crippling strike in July, they're dismissive of the Soviet parliament's attempts to ban any future stoppage. Nowhere is this clearer than at the strike committee, still in existence to ensure Moscow keeps its promises to their men. They are in no doubt. Another strike is possible unless things improve. Travelling deep underground, the coalface sometimes an hour from the surface, the miners say they do back Gorbachev, but they will have little sympathy if he fails to deliver. Half a mile below the surface, Valery Blishik, the chairman of the local strike committee, meets the men after their grueling 6-hour shift. He hears their continuing problems, among them pensions, food supplies and pit safety. Individual miners told us the Kremlin must never take their support for granted. Nothing has changed since the strike, they said. The shelves are still bare. It's at small underground meetings like this that the Ukrainian miners are deciding how to react to events in Moscow. But there's no doubt their grievances remain the same, working conditions remain harsh, and their living standards scarcely improved in a decade. Some sit exhausted, almost too tired to move after their shift. Others return to the surface with growing doubts over whether their punishing work will ever be matched by improved conditions, above or below ground. Support among these men for Gorbachev's reforms is now on a knife edge. Robert Moore, News at 10, in the Ukraine.
Tanzania has told an international wildlife conference
Reports on the growing environmental crisis and the birth of a green movement. From Chernobyl, the Aral Sea and the Ural Mountains, Jane Corbin tells the story, The Poisoned Land, the Dying Sea.
On, an eerie no-man's land extends around the Chernobyl reactor. The streets of Pripyat, where the nuclear workers once lived, are silent and deserted. The political fallout from this ecological disaster has spread far beyond Chernobyl itself. It has forced the Soviet Union to question half a century of communist belief that technical achievement and productivity are more important than the environment. The radioactive zone around Chernobyl is still strictly controlled. 135,000 people evacuated from their homes will never return. The reactor, with its pine tree memorial to those who died, has itself become a monument to the culpability of a system which is accused of having hidden the truth, and so jeopardized the health of hundreds of thousands of its own people.
The world's worst nuclear accident focused the minds of the Soviet people on their environment, neglected and exploited for decades. Now, encouraged by glasnost, a green movement is growing. Across the Soviet Union, people are protesting against Moscow's state planners, who they believe have poisoned their air, their water, and their land.
Nature is dying, and when nature dies, then so will man. But people still aren't conscious of this. In destroying nature, man can destroy himself.
If there's nothing to breathe, nothing to drink, whatever you can buy in the shops is useless. What good are clothes or food if there's no water, no air? Until recently, the economy was the government's chief concern. Now ecology is becoming our top priority.
Apachichi, 10 miles from the Chernobyl reactor, is a ghost village. Contaminated by fallout, it was evacuated 3 years ago. In defiance of the authorities, a few homesick old people have returned. They don't understand that their orchards, their fields, their whole countryside, which appears so normal, is polluted with radioactivity that won't decay for decades. Their children and grandchildren will never return to Apachichi. Hundreds of villages have inherited Chernobyl's poisoned legacy.
The mushrooms were wonderful that summer, but the militia kept chasing us away, saying, "When are you going to go?" But I stayed here with my cow and pigs, and I live very well.
People live in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Why can't we live on our land? We've got to live on our native soil. No one can take us away.
But the Chernobyl fallout spread beyond Apachichi, across the Ukraine, and there are accusations that officials have lied about the extent of contamination. The accident happened before Mr. Gorbachev and Glasnost were established. Now Chernobyl's a public test of his resolve to tackle the environment. Today, the reactor itself has been extensively decontaminated. It's become something of a showpiece for international visitors. The Soviets have been praised for the way they've handled the aftermath of the accident at the plant. Of the 4 reactors, 2, undamaged in the blast, have been restarted despite Ukrainian protests. Workers in the contaminated zone are monitored as they pass through radiation detectors in every part of the plant. They get double the normal salary, special food and long periods off duty outside the Chernobyl area.
Engineering measures have made the reactors safe, but we keep a strict watch on radiation, and workers are given medicals before going on shift. Anyone who turns up for work sick won't be allowed to work. And after the accident, we began extra health programs like massage and acupuncture to restore the well-being of the staff at Chernobyl.
But in Chernobyl's own greenhouses, where the soil was exposed to radioactivity, there's disturbing evidence of the effects on plant life. These young pine trees may look normal, but scientists told us radiation has caused gigantism and mutations. 2 or 3 needles sprout in place of 1. They're often twice their normal length. Now people are worried about their health as reports of twisted, abnormal plants spread. 1,500 square kilometers of the Ukraine are contaminated, but this has only now been admitted after 3 years. Only in the 30-kilometer, virtually uninhabited zone round the reactor itself has there been any decontamination. But the fallout passed beyond this, northwards over Byelorussia and westwards over Narodichi, a Ukrainian district where 25,000 people still live. Confidential government maps have now been published, which show the widespread of radioactive hotspots across these regions. Independent scientists are alarmed.
The situation around Narodichi is very serious. We don't know what dose people absorbed when the cloud passed over. We haven't fully studied the pattern of fallout or the interreaction between radiation and agricultural chemicals. I think most of the fallout was in the form of concentrations of radioactive particles, hotspots, which are very dangerous for people and the environment. 12 villages around Narodichi should be evacuated.
In Veliki Kleschi, 60 miles from Chernobyl, families are loading their trucks with their belongings and leaving. Everyone feels the same, this man told us. It isn't safe to stay. The authorities have now admitted, 3 years after the accident, that Veliki Kleschi suffered high levels of contamination. They've conceded that families with young children should be moved, but they also say it could take 5 years. Jobs and housing elsewhere are scarce. No extra funds are being provided by Moscow. Galia Kolesnik is pregnant with her 3rd child, but her family has no prospect of moving.
We have to look for a place ourselves. Official promises don't come to much. If you can't find a place yourself, you can't really leave.
Outside a house where an old woman lives with her grandchild, worried village officials, who have no monitoring equipment of their own, asked us to take measurements of the radiation. Our dosimeter recorded levels 10 times higher than around the Chernobyl reactor itself. So it's 10 microsieverts. This is twice the limit recommended in Britain for nuclear shift workers in a controlled environment, 20 times the maximum limit an ordinary family should be exposed to day in and day out. The people of Narodichi say government scientist Ilya Liktaryov is no longer welcome in their area. He still insists it is safe to live there.
People living outside the 30-kilometer zone can have more or less significant doses of radiation, but all these doses are within permissible limits. There are villages where a real threat exists, where radioactive cesium in the food is above the norm, but we've taken tens of thousands of measurements in these regions, and I can now guarantee we have a system of controlling food that provides complete safety.
Ukrainian produce once fed much of the Soviet Union, but no one now wants vegetables from Narodichi's farms. Workers are given a ruble each a day to buy clean produce from outside the contaminated areas. But there isn't enough to go round, distribution is patchy, and pensioners don't get the supplement. So many families continue eating food grown on contaminated ground.
The children mainly eat clean produce at school, but often it's of poor quality. And anyway, they drink the local water. And of course, their parents do give them vegetables from their own private plots.
Alarm about the contamination of the food chain has spread, with reports from local farms of increased animal deformities. Cows graze on contaminated land. On the Lenin Collective farm in Narodichi, calves have been born with varying degrees of deformity. This one has half a muzzle. Its tongue protrudes, its lip and one of its nostrils are missing. Animals with worse deformities don't survive long, but farmers have taken photographs. Calves with twisted skulls, piglets with abnormal protuberant eyes, webs of tissue in place of the normal eyeball. A stillborn foal with 8 legs twisted together back and front. It's difficult to prove deformities have increased because of the accident. No statistics were kept before, but local vets have no doubts.
Abnormalities have mainly been recorded in the most contaminated areas. Before 1986, farmers noted isolated instances of deviation from the norm, but since the accident, 50 calves and 146 piglets have been born with abnormalities, without limbs, ears or eyes. We vets put it down to the increased radioactivity.
Children are examined at the Narodichi clinic to see how much radioactivity they've absorbed. 500 children, 1 in 10, have seriously enlarged thyroids. Thousands more, some degree of enlargement, an indication they've absorbed significant doses of radiation. Amongst older people, doctors have noted changes in the immune system. Eye cataracts have increased tenfold since the accident. Cancer rates have risen by 13%. The authorities say it's too early to notice an increase in tumours, and dietary deficiencies could explain the children's swollen thyroids. These explanations anger local nurses.
I want to say to the world, this must never happen again, not here or in any country. All our children have enlarged thyroids. What do we do now? Wait for every second or third child to die of cancer? These are children we've raised and nurtured. We just want them to be able to run through the green grass, breathe the air, see the sun. That's all we want. Experts have been here, Soviet and foreign ones, and proved everything is fine, but it's like a holiday resort. It's just not true.
Journalists, not scientists, revealed what was happening in Narodichi. Government officials accuse the media of creating an irrational fear of radiation, radiophobia. They insist families are suffering psychological, not physical symptoms. But the editor who published the story says there's been a cover-up.
We journalists are concerned that no one has seriously been asked to answer for the disasters that have happened. With regard to Chernobyl, we want to bring legal proceedings against officials who used their positions not to reveal the true radiation levels. There were orders not to disclose information, and we want to name names and demand they accept responsibility.
There was a lack of information. The vacuum was filled by inaccurate stories, disinformation by journalists in search of sensation, Soviet and foreign reporters. Now everything is open. We provide full information, but people don't believe us. I'm skeptical their trust will return in the near future. If there had been openness from the day of the accident, then perhaps radiophobia would not have developed to the same extent.
No, it's not radiophobia. They're hushing it all up. There was a cover-up for 2.5 years, and it's still going on. It's not radiophobia. The illnesses are connected only with radiation, and we want these people prosecuted. No one can improve our health now, and we want them prosecuted for the damage they've caused.
What started at Chernobyl has spread throughout the Soviet Union. People are demanding the central authorities accept responsibility for damaging the environment and cancel new industrial projects. In a suburb of Moscow, families are marching on a Sunday to demonstrate against a new power station. The young, the old, ordinary families are part of a growing green movement. The police usually tolerate these protests. Even local issues like this can draw a crowd of several thousand to express their anger at another industrial plant imposed by Moscow's central planners without public consultation.
We call ourselves green because we're fighting to preserve the life and health of our children and keep the forests green, the air clean, and water fit to drink.
Eminent members of the Academy of Sciences, the scientific establishment, are speaking out, even entering politics to fight the green cause.
16% of our country is an ecological disaster zone. For 2 or 3 years, people have been campaigning for a better environment, striking, protesting, petitioning, because it's becoming increasingly difficult to live. The quality of life is worsening, infant mortality is increasing. Environmental problems have become a question of survival, and so there's a strong ecological movement. Every second People's Deputy has a platform of green demands.
The People's Deputies are back in session. The new parliament has become a political forum for the green movement. From all over the country, deputies with local environmental grievances demand legal controls over the powerful central ministries which run the nation's industry. Mr. Gorbachev has responded by appointing a new environment minister. No one wanted the job. 6 men turned it down before a non-party member accepted.
I'm absolutely convinced of the sincerity of President Gorbachev and our Prime Minister Ryzhkov. They understand the seriousness of the situation, and I understand it too. But it doesn't necessarily follow that they or I see an easy way out of our ecological problems.
The Aral Sea was once the world's 4th largest inland lake, a sea the size of Ireland. Now it's threatened with extinction thanks to man's interference. This graveyard of ships stranded on the seabed is witness to the triumph of central planning over local interests. For 20 years, as the water disappeared, an official silence prevailed in Moscow. Not until last year was the plight of the Aral fully revealed when the first expedition of Soviet scientists and writers visited the region. The deputy editor of Novy Mir, the nation's leading literary magazine, led the expedition.
The sea is simply dead. There's practically no life, no fish. Even seagulls and migratory birds don't stop there anymore. The sea is dead. I'd compare it to the Chernobyl catastrophe. That took place in a minute. The Aral Sea disaster has taken several years. It's a creeping Chernobyl.
The Aral Sea in Soviet Central Asia is bounded by the republics of Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan and the Karakalpak. An inland salt sea, it is fed by the Sirdarya and the Amu Darya rivers. For the past 20 years, these rivers have been partially diverted to irrigate rice and cotton. As a result, the Aral has been robbed of water. Its volume has shrunk by 2/3. If the rate of water loss continues, the sea will all but disappear by the year 2000. Kazakhstan is 1,000 miles from Moscow. Its people are closer culturally to China than to Russia. Their ancestors came from as far away as Mongolia and Turkey. Their way of life is now threatened by decisions made in Moscow 30 years ago, decisions which have had a profound and damaging effect on their environment. The whole climate of Central Asia is becoming hotter and more arid as the Aral Sea shrinks. Once the lake was an oasis in the desert, a vital source of water. The Aral's vast surface also tempered weather conditions and made life in the harsh Asian steppes bearable. Now the delta of the once mighty Sirdarya River, one of the sources of water, has dwindled to a trickle. It barely reaches the Aral. The Amu Darya to the south is in a similar plight. As a result, the concentration of salt in what little water is left has risen dramatically. As the lake recedes, layers of dried salt are left on the sands to be whipped into the atmosphere by the wind. For mile upon mile, the seabed stretches, broken only by abandoned fishing villages. The men have been forced to leave and look for fish hundreds of miles away. Today, only a few children and women are left.
The whole reorientation of agriculture resulted in the shrinking of the lake and consequences that weren't foreseen. Now we have to improve people's lives. It must be treated as an ecological disaster. As the ecology of the region has been disrupted, so has the balance of nature, and it's a real catastrophe.
The catastrophes come about because hundreds of miles upstream from the Aral, the river's been diverted to irrigate vast tracts of land for agriculture alien to the desert, rice and cotton. These are thirsty crops demanding millions of gallons of water. Canals were built and the desert's been turned into a paddy field. 40% of this precious water is lost in the sand. It was part of Brezhnev's grandiose scheme to force man's will on nature, a state plan imposed by Moscow. The nation needed rice and cotton, and this region was forced to grow them. 30 times the normal quantities of fertilizers and pesticides are needed to stimulate productivity in unsuitable terrain. A poisonous chemical cocktail seeps from the paddies into the diminished river and on to the Aral to add to the salt already there.
Our expedition asked who's to blame for the destruction of the Aral Sea, and we concluded that our system is at fault. But there were people within the system, and the official body responsible was the Ministry of Water Resources. The destruction of the Aral is a symbol of mismanagement, a memorial to the years of stagnation.
The central planning of the Brezhnev years destroyed the traditional economy in the town of Aralsk. The only clue to its prosperous past are the rusting docks now stranded 30 miles from the water's edge. As late as 1963, Aralsk was a thriving port, the center of an extensive sea trading network. Fishing was the main industry. In 1921, when Volgograd was threatened with starvation, Aralsk responded to Lenin's appeal and sent 400 wagon loads of fish in a single day. The shores of the lake abounded with wildlife, and migratory birds gathered here in huge flocks. The rare wild horse, the kulano, lived on islands in the sea. Today, a lone Kulano gallops across the dry seabed. The breed is almost extinct. Only a few swans are left of the extensive bird life. Beneath the waters, only 4 out of 38 species of fish are left, and the fishermen are reduced to casting their nets in the shallow waters of the river delta, the only place fish can live. Once the haul almost broke the nets. Now a whole day's fishing yields a pathetic catch.
In a month's time, we'll have to move to a place called Zeysan, 900 kilometers away, because there aren't any fish left here. It's difficult to go so far, but at least there are fish there, and so we'll have to go.
Aralsk is suffering a severe water shortage. The whole water table has been affected by the shrinking sea and increasing salinity. Wells have dried up or been contaminated by salt and chemicals. What little water is left is stagnant, a breeding ground for typhoid. Cases have increased here by 29 times. Every drop of drinking water must be piped from 100 miles away and laboriously collected from public pumps. 15,000 people have left the area as living conditions worsen. Aralsk now has open sewers and children play on a refuse dump in the center of town. A Communist Party newspaper has revealed that 83% of the Aral's children have some kind of illness. The market shelves are almost empty. Abundant produce once grew here, but the fields are too dry now. The lack of water has impoverished the region and brought disease. This region has the highest infant mortality rates in the Soviet Union, 4 times the national average. For years, the authorities concealed the figures, but now official statistics have revealed that 59 in 1,000 newborn babies die. This rate's comparable to the poorest third world nation. An inadequate diet means that nearly half the pregnant women are anemic, even their breast milk's contaminated by chemicals in the food and water.
The high figures are connected with environmental changes and social conditions. Recently, more babies are being born prematurely, and there are more and more miscarriages, many caused by fetal abnormalities. We frequently see congenital defects, especially in babies born to women who've had late miscarriages. There's a lack of vitamins and green vegetables. Fresh food isn't grown here.
Salt and chemical deposits left by the shrinking sea have caused a dramatic increase in cancer of the throat. TB rates have doubled. The very air is poisoned by 65 million tons of salt, pesticides and dust whipped by the winds every year from the dry seabed. The old local leaders who implemented Brezhnev's plan admit the consequences were never considered, and the whole nation, they say, is to blame.
Everywhere the priority was to increase productivity, the amount of rice and so on. No one thought about ecology. This disaster concerns not just our region, but the entire nation. In a way, we, the older generation, have some responsibility. We weren't far-sighted enough to see the dangers. We all tried to fulfill the plan, but it ended up such a disaster.
A single weather station records increasing temperatures and falling humidity levels. But despite a government decree, nothing has yet been done to increase the river's flow. The ministry responsible for saving the Aral is the same one that presided over its destruction. As for the ruined local economy, one fish farm has been set up, but can't produce enough fish for even a single village. The level of the sea is still falling.
The decision to restore the Aral must be the #1 priority. It can only be achieved by changing the structure of the economy. Returning the Aral to its former size will mean replacing current water-demanding crops with less water-consuming ones. Resolving the problem will be a long process, and we won't see any results for several years.
The people of the Aral cannot save their sea alone. At a recent local congress, speakers appealed for urgent help from the outside world. They warned that otherwise the disappearance of the Aral could provoke far-reaching climatic changes.
20 years from now, it will snow in July in Uzbekistan and in Kazakhstan if the Aral dies. The whole balance of nature is being disrupted. The Aral is dying. It is not too late yet to save it, but in 5 or 6 years it will be. We can still rescue the Aral and ourselves. If we don't save it, we can't save Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, or even perestroika.
The Aral, like Chernobyl, is a man-made disaster of such massive proportions that it may even now be beyond help. But these global catastrophes are mirrored across the Soviet Union in hundreds of smaller-scale but equally damaging decisions imposed here in Moscow by the all-powerful planning ministries. Just as the success of perestroika, economic revival, will depend on the attitude of the bureaucracy, so environmental reform hinges on central government departments. They will have to reconsider policies which have blighted nature and poisoned cities.
It's the government departmental approach that's to blame. The central ministries effectively have had a monopoly on deciding where to build factories. Local authorities aren't strong enough to block these projects, so you get a concentration of hazardous plants in one place. That's why 104 cities have become ecologically dangerous places. In 56 cities, pollution is 10 times the permissible level. 40 million people live in unfavorable environmental conditions.
Stalin's city of steel, Magnitogorsk. Hundreds of chimneys spew out waste from 10 massive blast furnaces, 35 smelting workshops, the largest metalworks in the world. Once a proud monument to communist ambitions, now the plant is a dinosaur, poisoning a town that has no future without it. Magnitogorsk was built from nothing, 1,000 miles east of Moscow on a barren steppe in the Ural Mountains. On Stalin's orders, hundreds labored and died to build a steelworks on this rich seam of iron ore. It was a feat of mass heroism, proof the workers' will could overcome the obstacles of nature. But pride in the past is today overshadowed by anxiety about the town's future. The Kombinat, as the steel plant is known, produced the metal for every second tank and every third shell used by Russia in World War II. Today, this one plant produces 10% of Soviet steel, 160 million tons a year. But the technology's hardly changed since the war. The steel's no longer of a high enough quality for weapons. It's used for car bodies and basic nuts and bolts. And the obsolete open hearth system produces 865,000 tons of air pollutants every year. The filtration system is almost non-existent. In producing this steel, the Kombinat's chimneys poison the air with 9 times the legal limit of benzene, 5 times the legal limit of sulfur compounds. Last year, the local newspaper, the Magnitogorsk Worker, shocked its readers by publishing statistics on air pollution and the increase in disease. Glasnost was forced on this conservative town by a group of young journalists. As with Chernobyl and the Aral, the newly emboldened media played a decisive role in arousing public awareness of environmental dangers.
Our paper has chosen to speak the truth. It was very difficult to start with. When we published complete statistics about the ecological situation in our town, it had a bombshell effect. Now, we and the whole town have the problem of what to do with this information. How can we live with the facts which have been revealed?
The paper confirmed what doctors knew already but had been afraid to say openly. The hospital's cancer wards are overflowing, despite the extra beds they've squeezed in. Many of the patients we saw had worked for the Kombinat. Lung cancer rates have doubled in Magnitogorsk in the last decade. The majority of children have chronic bronchial diseases. Stillbirths are a third higher in the town than in the area around.
The extremely high incidence of lung cancer and other chest diseases is the result of pollutants produced by the combinat. For a long time, our system has talked about caring for the health of people, but it hasn't done anything. There was a need for metal, above all metal, and people haven't been taken care of.
Magnitogorsk is a company town. All streets lead to the steelworks. The Lenin Metallurgical Combinat dominates the city. The livelihood of virtually every family depends on this industry. Of a total population of 450,000 men, women and children, 63,000 people work for the combinat.
Until now, Magnitogorsk has remained Stalin's brainchild. Stalin's Magnitogorsk and nothing else. It continues to be a product of the Central Administrative Command System and is its faithful soldier. If this soldier changed his allegiance and obeyed the will of ordinary people and did not live for metal production alone, then maybe there would be changes. But at the moment, it's just a pipe dream.
Magnitogorsk can ill afford pollution control. The plant is obsolescent, and the seam of iron ore that gave birth to the town has been exhausted. Every day, 700 wagon loads of ore have to be brought in from up to 1,500 miles away. Magnitogorsk can only operate because the state pays for transport and raw materials. One new converter workshop is being built. It's a cleaner way of making steel. But this one modern facility will only reduce pollution overall by 20%. Local scientists recommended a more radical solution. It required more investment, though it could have produced cheaper steel in the long term. But the ministry decided on the converter, which many believe is no solution.
There's no doubt the converter won't solve the problem. It can only make it to some extent less acute by decreasing the waste from the old furnaces. It will only slightly change the existing technology for the better as regards waste products, but it won't solve the problem completely.
The economic problem is that the new equipment we're installing is 10 or even 50 times as expensive as the current plant. And reconstructing the manufacturing process as such doesn't bring in any profit. It only becomes profitable when the steel is turned into actual products. We won't be doing that until the second stage of our reconstruction. In fact, the converter will reduce our economic efficiency for the first year.
Vladimir Kulpin has worked for the combinat since he left school. So did his father and his wife's father too. This generation is aware of the dangers of pollution in a way their parents never were, but they also know there's a trade-off between the cost of cleaner air and economic performance. Vladimir's job provides security and a reasonable salary by Soviet standards. Modernizing the plant would improve the town's health, but it could also reduce employment. That would hit every family. Magnitogorsk represents perestroika's dilemma.
When my husband left school, he trained to be a steel worker. And I suppose he's not at the age when he can change to something else. His work is hard, and the air he breathes isn't good, but we try to make sure he rests and goes fishing when he has a day off.
The workers know about the air pollution caused by the combinat, but we aren't working for some ideal, but for money. And so we have to carry on. There's the central plan and orders to be fulfilled. After all, we've got to live. We know the dangers, but we have to work.
Vladimir Kulpin and the other workers can't believe there's little future for Magnitogorsk. They're pinning their hopes on perestroika, giving them financial independence, an incentive to improve production. At present, the Ministry of Metals takes 83% of the steelworks' turnover. The combinat reports directly to Moscow, and the local management has few incentives to safeguard the town's health.
Not only does the central ministry take most of the steelworks' profits, it also pays any fines levied on the plant for polluting the air or water. So this industry can afford to, and often does, ignore the law. People here say that often at night, such filters as exist are often illegally switched off, so making it almost impossible to breathe. Financial independence would not only earn the steelworks money, it would also force them to pay their own fines, a powerful incentive to improving the environment.
If only we get support from on high, not just ministerial, but government approval, we can extend perestroika and improve our plant. We'll be able to earn money for our own capital investment. We don't want to ask anybody for anything. We want to earn funds for modernization ourselves, so we can raise pay and solve social problems.
Magnitogorsk has made its contribution to the nation and its defense. Now the young generation, born in the shadow of the Kombinat, believes the nation should repay its debt to Magnitogorsk. It may be part of a system they now reject, as they reject their poisoned environment. But to abandon Magnitogorsk is unthinkable.
The Kombinat is a museum, a monster devouring itself, producing for the sake of production, not for people. But now we demand, above everything else, the right to lead a normal human life.
I'm convinced a clean environment also costs money, and it'll cost more and more. But is it necessary to have more and more energy? What limits are there? Do we need more and more industry? I don't want to stop progress, but maybe it's time to think again.
Across the Soviet Union, people are looking at the results of half a century of industrial progress and deciding the human and ecological costs are too great. But setting limits on progress to save the environment and at the same time satisfying the workers' aspirations for a better life is the colossal task facing perestroika and Mr. Gorbachev.
In next week's Panorama, Charles Wheeler.
4 million Catholics in the Soviet Republic of the Ukraine may be given back the right to worship after Mikhail Gorbachev sees the Pope next week. The Catholic faith in the Ukraine, which centers around Lvov, has been repressed for 50 years, first by the Nazis and then by Joseph Stalin. At their historic meeting, Pope John Paul and Mr. Gorbachev are expected to settle what has been the key stumbling block to relations between Moscow and the Vatican. But as our Moscow correspondent David Smith now reports, by freeing the Catholic Church, the Soviet leader may well encourage widespread political upheaval.
The old Polish city of Lvov, the capital of the Western Ukraine, the home of Soviet Catholicism. And today, the new frontier for Mr. Gorbachev's experiment with freedom. This is Preobrazhensky Cathedral,